to all of you present here today. I'm Meenakshi, student in the PhD program in Sociology at South Asian University, the only successful South venture. And I welcome you to the Contributions to Contemporary Knowledge Lecture 2017, presented by the Faculty of Social Sciences in collaboration with the Department of Sociology, South Asian University, IIC, the journal Society and Culture in South Asia. Our lecture series began in 2013. Subsequently, the Department of Sociology, South Asian University, also launched the journal Society and Culture in South Asia that it co-publishes with Sage India. Society and Culture in South Asia is a peer-reviewed journal published biannually with articles in the fields of sociology, social anthropology, political sciences, the arts, and other related disciplines of the social sciences and humanities. Ever since it emerged, the journal has been in the background of Contributions to Contemporary Knowledge lecture series. For further details, kindly refer to the journal flyer that has been handed out to all of you. We also encourage you to contribute to our journal and make it a more engaging and enriching intellectual platform for nurturing the idea of South Asia. I would also like to take this opportunity to express our gratitude to the India International Center for being our partner in many such academic endeavors of the Faculty of Social Sciences in general and the Department of Sociology in particular. Over these years, despite its notoriety for being over-vocal and overactive, as the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu had once said, with regard to the discipline, that it's a troublemaker. Established in 2011, and as I just hinted, the FSS is active throughout the year in organizing academic workshops, lectures, seminars, and conferences beyond our regular teaching to make our engagements with the social sciences much more vibrant and nuanced, at least on the front stage. I would seize this opportunity to announce that as a part of the FSS's overall academic agenda, the Department of Sociology, South Asian University, in collaboration with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and IIC, is organizing an international conference on contemporary capitalism and the revolutionary possibilities 150 years after capital and 100 years after Russian Revolution on the 3rd and 4th of November 2017 at the Indian International Center. Registrations for the same are now open, free of course, since it's been organized by the Marxist School. As part of our commitment to the idea of South Asia, let me also gladly announce that we will be conducting a discussion here at IIC, scheduled for the 16th of January 2018 at 6 in the evening on the book titled Another South Asia, edited by Dr. Devnath Pathak and published by Primus. We request you to kindly enter your name, phone numbers, and email addresses, which you might already have done at the registration desk. In a time when there is a serious attempt at monopolizing Gandhi, we make a small effort at claiming Gandhi as ours for this evening, with the hope that it would not disturb the monopoly too much. May I now invite the speaker of CCK 2017, Dr. Faisal Devji, the chair and discussant, Professor Abhijit Pathak, and Professor Sasanko Pereira to kindly come to the dais. I would now invite Professor Sasanko Pereira, Professor of Sociology, Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences, and Vice President, South Asian University. Professor Pereira is also the Editor-in-Chief of the journal Society and Culture in South Asia. I would request Sir to kindly deliver the welcome address.
Good evening, friends and colleagues, and thank you, Meenakshi. Let me welcome all of you. It's nice to see so many people. On behalf of the South Asian University, this was supposed to be done by our president, but she excused herself because she has to be with her family this evening before they go overseas tomorrow. I want to do basically three things as a ritual requirement to set the record what we have done so far in this series, and then introduce the speaker and the chair, and then say something about the future of this series. Now, this is the fifth consecutive edition of contributions to contemporary knowledge lecture. The Faculty of Social Sciences began planning for this in 2012. We started with a lecture by Professor Gananath Obesekara, Professor Emeritus in Anthropology at Princeton University. And that was in 2013, followed by Professor S.D. Moni, formerly of JNU, in 2014. Professor Keith Hart from University of Pretoria in 2015. Professor Sugato Bose from Harvard University in 2016. And this year we have Professor Faisal Devji coming to be with us from Oxford. And thank you, Faisal, for taking the time. And we are also thankful to Professor Abhijit Pathak for agreeing to chair the event. Professor Pathak has helped us in more than one ways since the inception of our university, from the tiniest of events to major public engagements, such as this one. So thank you, Abhijit. For a brief moment in the recent past, few months ago, we thought that our half a decade of work in organizing this lecture series had come to an untimely end, putting into context the generally well-known Buddhist tenet that all living things must come to an end at some point, which is also South Asian common sense. This is when the university suggested that the series should be closed down due to lack of funds, which I understood, or it should rotate among other faculties. The latter was simply unacceptable to me. After all, we did not design this series as something that could be so easily submerged within the undifferentiated institutional personalities of everybody else. This was about what we are and what we wanted to do. We wanted to create an interdisciplinary discussion forum and not a kind of fruit salad that could be rented out. Of course, there is nothing to stop anybody else from starting an initiative like this within our university or elsewhere. Now, the compromise is that the series will remain with us, but with restricted funding from the university. But within 2 weeks of making that decision, we have raised the extra funds necessary to make it happen next year. And I want to thank the President of the university for continuing to support us to the best of the university's abilities, and my colleague Ravi Kumar for helping us raise the extra funds that was necessary in a very short period of time. It's good to have colleagues who don't understand the meaning of no when it's necessary. As a result of all this, next year, on 19th of March, in this very same place, we will have Professor Nancy Fraser to deliver the Contributions of Contemporary Knowledge Lecture 2018, and she will talk on redistribution, recognition, and the crisis of hegemony, the rise and fall of reactionary populism, right here. Now, let me introduce the speaker and the chair. Professor Faisal Devji is University Reader in Modern South Asian History and Fellow of St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford. After receiving his PhD in Intellectual History from University of Chicago, he has held appointments at Harvard and Yale Universities, the New School for Social Research in New York, as well as visiting professorships at the Graduate Institute in Geneva and Cornell University. His work is in intellectual history and political thought, focusing on India, Pakistan, and global Islam, as well as on the phenomenon of globalization more broadly. Among Professor Devji's works are the following books: Landscapes of the Jihad, Militancy, Morality and Modernity, published in 2005, The Terrorist in Search of Humanity, Militant Islam and Global Politics, published in 2009, The Impossible Indian, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence, published in 2012, and Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea, published in 2013. His new work is on Hindu and Muslim political thought in India, as well as a projected book on the modern invention and coming destruction of Islam as a conceptual category. Professor Abhijit Pathak is Professor of Sociology at the Center for the Study of Social Systems at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is popular among students for teaching courses such as Modern Indian Social Thought and Culture and Personality. He writes very extensively on issues of education, schooling, and Indian modernity. A few of his works include the following: Indian Modernity, Contradictions, Paradoxes, and Possibilities, published in 2008 and 2015. Recalling the Forgotten, Education and Moral Quest, published in 2009. The Social Implications of Schooling, Knowledge, Pedagogy, and Consciousness, published in 2013. Modernity, Globalization, and Identity, Toward a Reflexive Quest, published in 2005. The Rhythm of Life and Death, published in 2011, and so on. And more importantly, he is often a supporter of what we do. To me, that is important. So I think the ritual obligation is done. And let me thank all of you for being here. And for the rest of the evening, Anakshi will keep our lives organized. Please.
May I now request Professor Pathak to kindly take over the proceedings, sir?
I think we should begin right now. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid my Gujarati Asmita has taken a bit of a hit from the Delhi pollution. So I do hope you will forgive me if I descend into a fit of hacking every now and then. I'll try not to do so. While Gandhi spoke frequently about humanity and humanitarianism, he was deeply suspicious of any attempt to serve or even speak in the name of the human race. In Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule, his manifesto from 1909, he wrote, "I am so constructed that I can only serve my immediate neighbors," Aspas Vasta Manaso in the Gujarati text, "but in my conceit I pretend to have discovered that I must with my body serve every individual in the universe. In thus attempting the impossible, man, Manas Jat, comes in contact with different natures, different religions, and is utterly confounded." Gandhi considered the effort to address mankind as a whole fundamentally violent, and often described it as a sin. This was because man's universality could only become manifest by destroying the social particularities that both obscured and made it possible. It was the singularity of one's neighbors whose moral and political precedence Gandhi thought was especially compromised by mankind's universality. Not that he held neighbors to be worth more than strangers in the sense of favoring them, for like friends and relatives, they were also the first to be opposed when doing wrong. This being the true lesson of Swadeshi, or a preferential concern with one's surroundings, whose virtue could only go abroad by serving as an example but not instruction to others. So the thing about focusing on one's neighbors and those close to one is not that you had to favor them over others, but the contrary. You had to, in fact, sacrifice them first. And this, of course, is a lesson that he takes from the Bhagavad Gita. Apart from being doomed to failure, Gandhi recognized any attempt to grasp the human race beyond one's neighborhood as being a product of modern civilization and its obsession with technology. This was why he expressed his distrust of mankind in Swaraj in a passage on the evil of railways and the hubris of power and expansion they created. As a critic of modern civilization, Gandhi objected to its desire for universality. Of this, the social or political instantiation of the human race, envisaged either in its potential control by some institution, no matter how representative, or by its own domination of the world, provided an important and to him fearsome example of despotism. While such universal ideals as humanity and others like freedom were enthusiastically taken up by many anti-colonial thinkers, in other words, the Mahatma focused instead on their darker aspects and links with imperialism, which he considered the most important political manifestation of the technologically driven urge to universality in his time. And yet he refused to become a partisan for the particular either, recognizing it as a category dependent upon the universal and so partaking of its logic. How then might mankind's universality be engaged without adopting the role of a particularity or dismissing it altogether for some nostalgic singularity? So when criticizing the figure of the universal as embodied potentially in mankind, what Gandhi is not doing is saying, I am a partisan of the particular, because he understands that particularity is itself part of the logic of the universal. Gandhi approached the universal in a negative way, by refusing it any positive identity that might be colonized by some group or another. Such was the status of his key concept of ahimsa or non-violence, for example, whose explicitly negative character, ahimsa, entailed, among other things, the presumption that it could possess no history. For as the Mahatma noted in Hind Swaraj, only violence had a history, not simply because it intended to constitute the subject of most historical narratives, but also because it was a category invariably linked to positive objectives, if not identities. But it was non-violence that in Gandhi's view existed everywhere and did the work of sustaining families, societies, and indeed the world, not the violence whose aim could only be that of safeguarding certain individuals, peoples, or states at the cost of others. Yet non-violence could not be understood as universal so much as ubiquitous, since it had no positive character. It was in this sense non-universal rather than particular or singular, in the way classical Indian philosophical terms like Advaita or non-dualism and Neti-Neti, neither this nor that, could not be reduced to positive categories or particularities. They are part of a negative conception. The Mahatma's consistent deployment of negative concepts, of which non-cooperation was another, signaled that he was doing the reverse of defending any specific or even singular Indian trait. Instead of succumbing to some European idea of positive universality, or claiming to fulfill it, as both nationalists and socialists often did, he took the historical air out of universality and rendered it a negative or deferred notion, one with a properly philosophical pedigree. He was interested, in other words, in what I'm calling the non-universal. In this lecture, I shall look at the way Gandhi voiced his criticism of mankind's universality in his dealings with three contentious issues that defined its popular expression in his times: caste, conversion, and cow protection. Like his attention, so let me begin with caste. Like his attention to the village as a unit of governance, or self-consciously anarchist distrust of centralized states, the Mahatma's views about caste were meant to foreground India's singularities set against the politics or ethics of the universal. Of course, this didn't mean he advocated breaking links with the wider world, but rather conceived of them as being made up of an infinite number of small-scale relations, building up bit by bit into an oceanic circle, which in a famous article he contrasted to the hierarchical organization of the pyramid. This is why Swaraj, or self-rule, could be both individual and variously collective, because India's sheer diversity is what made her constituent units self-governing, and thus capable of coming together against the colonial state by refusing cooperation with it. It is only because groups like castes existed that non-cooperation, in his view, became possible. These are self-governing units. For had they been identified only as Indians, these men and women would have been dependent on the very state they were meant to resist, but which gave them meaning. And it was at least in part because he valued the sovereign potential in India's plurality that Gandhi conceived of castes as being equal but separate. Now, Gandhi's concern, not to say obsession, with pluralism might well have reinforced social hierarchies, and on occasion he even found it difficult to countenance the kind of syncretism that blurred the distinctions between the castes and religions which were so precious to him. So he was quite finicky about this. He was not a fan of syncretism. He actually quite liked separation. And I want to argue that there is an intellectual and philosophical basis to this position of his. But his struggle to prevent the hegemony of the universal in the abstract shape of mankind was also an enterprise to redefine Indian prejudices in moral and political practice. In doing so, he conversely and paradoxically universalized the language of caste in philosophical terms. So starting from a critique of universality and a distrust of the idea of mankind as being itself prompted by the technological prowess of imperialism and capitalism, Gandhi turns to caste as a kind of model of thinking about what I'm calling the non-universal. And he does so by criticizing the prescription. His critique, rather, is based upon the prescription of choice that is entailed in caste. Sexual choice, commensal choice, who you eat with, and occupational choice. Now, Gandhi had always been critical of choice and the kind of freedom it represented as a product of industrial capitalism, linking its very expansion to the infinite desire for commodities. Apart from this, choice was, in his view, also a category incapable of universalization and so self-contradictory, for it implied hierarchy even in the guise of a moral criterion, since as a mode of judgment, choice was premised upon the necessarily unequal knowledge, experience, and background of its agents. In place of the positive but false universality of choice or knowledge, therefore, Gandhi stood the negative one of sacrifice as a moral principle available to everybody, if in highly differentiated ways. And the example that he evokes repeatedly is from the Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna, the great hero, of course, is brought to the battlefield and he doesn't want to fight, and his charioteer, Lord Krishna, says that he must fight. You know the story. And in Gandhi's interpretation of it, one of Krishna's advices has to do with the fact that choice has become superfluous in this condition. Arjuna no longer has a choice. He has been brought to the battlefield of Kurukshetra because of a whole series of acts on his part and those of his brothers and those of his enemies. And if he were to simply abandon the battlefield, the war would still happen, but his side might lose. So choice is simply not the right way of thinking about moral action. Only duty, dharma, is. Right? So what you must do is to understand what your dharma, what your duty is, and fulfill it. So there are many such ways in which Gandhi criticizes choice as being linked to the culture of capitalism, of being non-universal, because of course, who can make a choice? Choices are informed, or they're meant to be informed, and therefore, of course, they are not democratic because they imply a hierarchy. A person who is more educated and more informed makes a better moral choice than a person who isn't so educated and informed. As opposed to choice, dharma, whose great example is sacrifice, is universal, or rather non-universal in the way I'm using that term, because it is available to everyone. Everyone can sacrifice. It can't be taken away from you. In order to make of caste prescriptions methods for holding back capitalist vision of freedom, Gandhi defined sacrifice as restraint, or brahmacharya, more commonly understood as a period or vocation of celibacy. For it was restraint or self-control in all matters that made society possible. Or as the Mahatma put it, quote, "The fact that the world rests on the observance more or less of brahmacharya or restraint means that it is necessary and practicable, unquote." It was only in the negative form of restraint or restriction, therefore, that Gandhi was willing to entertain the universal, or rather the non-universal. So he made the same case for ahimsa or non-violence as he did for brahmacharya, describing them as negative and even invisible forces that nevertheless sustained the world. For without non-violence and without restraint, society could not exist. Yet he hastened to add that for brahmacharya to function, untouchability had to be destroyed, since by pushing restraint into repulsion, it had lost its negative character to become a positive and so dangerous practice. And I quote him here. Just as the many dilapidated and useless parts of a building, if not pulled down, weaken the rest of the building, so the outer wall of untouchability weakens instead of protecting the inner wall of restrictions in regard to eating in company and marrying outside one's circle, unquote. Seen even in his own time as a most quixotic defense of caste, the Mahatma argued that interdining and intermarriage were no signs of solidarity and rather the reverse, as they tended in social reality to be part of a set of violent demands for rights over sexual partners that destroyed the very possibility of friendship. Indeed, he went so far as to point out that the intimacy of family life depended precisely upon the sexual unavailability of brothers and sisters, as well as of parents and children to one another. So he's trying to pose another vision of intimacy to the sexual one. And while sharing food, of course, didn't seem to fit into this account, Gandhi nevertheless condemned the crudely animal and so non-human nature of its solidarity, saying that eating should, like evacuating the bowels, be seen as a deeply personal activity, since both were, of course, directly related. He also pointed out that some Orthodox Hindus did not, in fact, dine even with their closest relatives. The Mahatma rejected bestial or merely biological definitions of human solidarity based on food and sexual sharing, advocating the moral and spiritual ones of friendship in their stead. This was true even of sexual partners, and I quote, "Marriage is meant to cleanse the hearts of the couple of sordid passions and take them nearer to God. Lustless love between husband and wife is not impossible. Man is not a brute. He has risen to a higher state after countless births in brute creation. He is born to stand, not walk on all fours or crawl. Bestiality is as far removed from manhood as matter from spirit." Unquote. Just as with food, therefore, Gandhi sought to sublimate or spiritualize sex by reducing it to a minimum so as to emphasize the human element in social relations as opposed to what he understood as the animal one. He was nevertheless careful to point out that he didn't take caste restrictions about eating and sex for hard and fast rules, but saw them instead as defenses against the indiscriminate forms of consumption that ended up destroying rather than fostering human relationships more generally. And I quote, "The rules which people observe in regard to food, water, and marriage are not essential features of Hinduism, but because self-control has been given special importance in Hinduism, restrictions have been laid down even to the smallest detail in regard to these matters. I do not think that they deserve to be condemned, but at the same time, I would not regard a person who does not observe them as having transgressed Dharma." Gandhi's conception of humanity, therefore, was radical because it was based on non-sharing and non-exchange. No sexual exchange and no food will commence an exchange. The very reverse of its conventional definition. We always think about species being as based on sexual and the exchange of sex and food. This latter he condemned as a bestial one, destructive of the moral and spiritual relations marking both family and friendship that were premised upon the interdiction of sexual exchange in particular, something that his contemporary Freud might equally have said. To be human then meant limiting as far as possible such biological imperatives in the making of individual as much as collective forms of solidarity, which he thought discouraged those based on spiritual and ideal bonds, or at least put them in the shade.